The following program is brought to you by the Classic Gamers Guild.
Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Water Cooler. I know it's been a little while since we brought you one of these episodes. It'll be even a little bit longer when Paul brings you one of these episodes, because unfortunately he's not here. But don't worry, in his place we have a very special guest. I'd like to welcome to the show Joshua Blum. He is the host of the 13th Hour podcast, and he is a big fan of the Rocketeer, which is our topic for today. So welcome to the show, Joshua.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Good to have you on. Before we get on to the topic of the Rocketeer, is there anything you'd like to tell our listeners about your podcast?
Yeah. So I started a podcast a number of years ago, just as a way of kind of exploring some creative things behind what I do. So I'm a writer. It's not my main gig, but it's sort of a side job. And I had written a book when I was just finished high school, an early draft of the book, which became the 13th Hour, which is the name of the podcast. And it was a book that was influenced by a lot of the things that I had enjoyed when I was growing up, namely a lot of like 80s movies. And I would probably put the Rocketeer in there. It's like it came out in 1991, but it's still sort of at that border of like the way kind of movies were done around that time. And these are things like The Never-Ending Story and
Right.
Labyrinth and Last Starfighter and The Rocketeer. Those things were all percolating in, my 18 or 19-year-old brain at the time. And I'd always been someone who came up with stories and drew pictures and, wrote music and things like that. So I kind of put all that together into this story, and the intention was never really to publish it. It was just something I wanted to do. But, flash forward like 20 years and I eventually did publish it. I kind of went back and wanted to kind of explore where a lot of those influences came from, because, it just, when you do something like that, it's just sort of part of you. And I started the podcast as a way of doing that and kind of also connecting with other people who are doing the same thing. So it's been a fun journey.
Mm-hmm. How long has your podcast been around now?
That is a good question. I started it actually for a very mundane reason, and that was in 2014, which was just to proofread an early copy of the book. And my daughter was a newborn at that time, and I would just sort of sit and read to her. And I figured it didn't really matter what I was reading. She was like a few weeks old, I think, at the time. And so I would read out loud, and I figured maybe I should just tape this. And I figured I could make a podcast out of it. And this is before I came up with the idea of kind of exploring the influences kind of thing. So I recorded an early draft of the book to like look for errors and things like that. And that took 15 episodes of about an hour each. And then, when I was done with that, I kind of went on hiatus for a while. I didn't really know what to do with the podcast. And then I eventually came up with the idea of like, okay, I'm going to use this to kind of explore where things come from and other kind of creative things like, I write music and stuff like that as kind of a soundtrack for the book. So it'd be kind of interesting, I thought, to like, work on a song at the same time, and show the creative process of how that happens, or work on how I do a picture. Or I recently gotten into like making little miniature figures as characters from the book out of clay and then casting them in resin. And so that was a whole thing that I kind of wanted to do. If you remember like a lot of like 80s, cartoons and stuff like that, Transformers and G.I. Joe and stuff like that. They had the cartoon,
course, yeah.
They had the comic, and then of course they had the toy line. And so it's this like trifecta. I don't know.
That's right.
The word? Yeah, where you have these three things, and so I figured, there's got to be a toy line, right? And so I just wanted to be able to do it, and it wasn't really something like I have to do it to sell. Like none of this is really to like make a lot of money or anything like that. It's more just for fun, and there's like sort of I guess a nostalgia factor built into it too.
Mm-hmm.
So to answer your question, since 2014.
2014. Wow, that's that seems like forever ago now. Because that's like the early 2010s, and we're now 2020.
Yeah.
That's crazy to think.
Yeah, I think things have gotten, just from the podcasting side of things, like there's been things have gotten easier.
Right.
And we were talking a little bit offline about, kind of the different ways of doing this stuff. And, I think if I started doing it later, I mean, I would be less, my process would probably be a little bit more streamlined. I'd probably still have some holdovers from the way you kind of had to do it before. So there's what it is. But yeah, so it's been a couple of years. And aside from that, I don't remember how long the hiatus between episode 15 and 16. I don't think I've missed a week. I just do one a week. I don't think I could do more than that, but I've tried to be pretty consistent about it.
Mm-hmm. All right. So you mentioned, of course, one of your big influences is the Rocketeer. And just before we get into that, are you a fan of, say, Dick Tracy? I think that came out in 1990.
When I was a kid, I was, but I don't think I remember watching the cartoon as a kid, and it was like from the, I don't know, 50s maybe? I don't know. I remember watching the cartoon a lot, but I never actually saw the movie. So that was, I think that, yeah, you're right. It came out the year before. And I think my parents probably thought I was too young for it, and they may very well have been right. Interestingly enough, that film was also another Disney property, I think, but it was released by Touchstone, and at least in the U.S., the Rocketeer was released by Disney. I think internationally it might have been Touchstone, but so it's been this like, I guess area of debate, whether if it had been released by another studio or the other subsidiary of Disney, whether it would have done better as a film, but who knows? For me, it was always like I one of the reasons I liked the film was kind of it sounds weird because I guess I kind of viewed it as almost like a diamond in the rough. Like a lot of people didn't seem to know of the movie, and I often enjoyed being able to tell them about it. Or the people that had seen it, they'd be, oh yeah, I liked it. I'm going to have to go rewatch that now. And so I guess it was this vaguely evangelistic kind of thing, but it felt like, whereas, it was easy to be like an Indiana Jones fan or Star Wars fan. There's plenty of stuff out there. There's like, comic books and novels and stuff like that. It was kind of, you had to work a little bit to be a Rocketeer fan, because like there was the comic books and that's kind of it. There was some merchandise available, but it came and went like really, really fast. So it was hard to find.
It certainly was nowhere on the level of the amount of exposure that Dick Tracy got. Because the year before Dick Tracy came out, did huge hype, like even before the movie came out. Like the cartoons were re-released, I should say, as hype for the movie to come out. And there was like toys. Like I knew everything about Dick Tracy before I actually saw the movie. Like there were comic books already,
right?
And all that sort of thing. And
the figures and everything.
Figures, like seriously, I think I read the comic book and already knew everything that happened in the movie before the movie even came out. So, but the thing is, when the movie actually came out, I think it was pretty well received by critics, but talking to people who saw it, people were pretty underwhelmed.
Right.
And if I recall, because I was pretty young, I was like about 10 or 11 around this time when Dick Tracy and Rocketeer came out. And I really got the feeling when the Rocketeer was coming out that it was kind of bearing a lot of the weight of Dick Tracy from the year before. So people kind of had that feeling like, oh, it's going to be another Dick Tracy. Now, I personally love Dick Tracy. That's like one of my favorite movies. And I did really like Rocketeer as well. they're very different movies, but I think that I kind of get this hunch. I was a really young, sheltered kid at the time, so I don't really know on a grander scale, but I really felt in my experience that The Rocketeer was really kind of following in an unfair footstep of what Dick Tracy had done the year before.
Yeah, I mean, that totally could be right. And I think, unfortunately, when it just, the luck of the draw of when it happened to be released, I think it was like around, was it Terminator 2 and like Robin Hood, the Kevin Costner one.
That's right.
And so I think the people that saw it liked it. And I didn't actually see it until like we like, as a family, we never went, we almost, I can't say never, but we almost never went to the theater. It was just like one of those sort of like, I don't know, extravagances that we just didn't do. Like it was always sort of tight in terms of finances and stuff like that. So, but we did see it. I think the one, I don't remember how this happened. I think the one sort of like splurge we did have was at some point my family got the Disney Channel, and it was released like sort of worldwide, I guess. It was what they said at the time, and it came out like a year after it actually had been in theaters. So it came out in 1992 on the Disney Channel, and it was slightly edited. Like the movie didn't have like a lot of like rough language or anything like that. No. But they edited even that down to for like Disney standards, I guess, or whatever. And which is kind of funny because some of the edits are in some ways fit a little bit better than the actual lines themselves, the sort of 1930s dialogue. But they edited it a little bit and they released it, like literally like a year later, and that's when I saw it.
Right.
And we taped it off the TV, and that's the tape that I would watch over and over and over again when I was within a couple of years. Like I remember, like, when I first saw it, I was like, oh, I like that. And I was about the same age as you were. And then at some point, maybe a couple of years later, I would regularly, like, we're not really allowed to watch TV that often. So I would get up before anybody else did, usually like a Sunday morning or something like that. And I would pop in the tape. And from the moment that it came on, like we had missed the very beginning, so we didn't press record. And so I actually never saw the first, 10 seconds of it for a long time. But from that point on, where for anyone who's seen the film, the film opens with an airplane, a GB racer being rolled out of a hangar. And there's this James Horner theme in the background, which is sort of like almost ethereal in the way it starts out, slow kind of piano and then rising in tempo. And from that point on, I was just like hooked. And it was like an hour and a half, however long I got to watch it, of totally being swept away to another world in a way. So I used to really look forward to that, and I'm not sure why I watched it over and over and over and over again, but I did. I really enjoyed it. That's what that's what kids do, I guess. But
yeah, it kind of is, especially when a movie like Rocketeer is so perfectly paced, for one thing, and it just got so much charm and character to it. I think one of the things though that might have thrown people off, and probably reason why a lot of people only kind of watched it once and not again, is that it kind of for those who don't really know much about it going in, and again, Rocketeer is another movie that I knew pretty much everything that was going to happen before we finally watched it, which was as soon as it came out on VHS for rental. Sure. So I'd done the same thing. I'd read all the comics and all that sort of thing. But I think the people who kind of went in might have been expecting a superhero movie, and it kind of really isn't. It's it presents like one, because you see, it's called The Rocketeer, and you see this guy in a cool suit flying through the air, but it's like, it's not really a superhero movie, at least not one as we really consider it today. or even at that time, because this was
no.
Batman came out in 1989, so
Right.
following in that, people might have had an expectation of the movie other than what it was. And honestly, The Rocketeer was just, I guess one thing about it, as I was watching it again, because we just got the Disney Plus, I kind of felt like it didn't concern itself with marketing to any one group. It just focused on being as good a movie as they could make using The Rocketeer. Right. And as a result, I kind of felt like I didn't really know exactly who was supposed to be watching it. Like, it was very family friendly. It was kind of there's a lot of goofiness to appeal for younger children. There's a lot of like adult humor and references and stuff like that. So I'm not sure if they're really trying to just cover all of their bases, but that's another thing. I kind of wonder if like just sort of that little they didn't quite sharpen the focus of the demographic. Maybe it didn't quite find a proper footing.
Yeah, I think that's one of those things that, if you, so just to, I mean, for anybody who hasn't seen the movie, I mean, you should go and watch it. Just if you can find a copy of it. I mean, it's a very simple premise. This happens in the 1930s, 1938 actually, in Los Angeles, and a stunt pilot, racing pilot, Cliff Secord, gets his hands on a rocket pack, and calamities ensue. And that's pretty much the way the comics take place. So the comics were done a lot earlier, and they were done by a guy named Dave Stevens, who this was like his, I don't say, kind of like magnum opus. I mean, he was kind of known for like one shots and like panels and covers and stuff like that. And this was like something he did as an actual comic with a story. And it took him a long time to do it. He did a lot of it himself. And at the time the movie actually came out, the two writers who wanted to turn his comics into an actual screenplay, Danny Bilson and DeMeo, they had been talking with Dave Stevens for a really long time. And working with Disney to try to turn it into something, and so it'd been a process of several years for them getting to that point. And the comics are different in some ways. I mean, there's a similar premise and everything like that, but the main character is a little bit more edgy, like sort of crotchety, edgy. His girlfriend in the comic is modeled after Betty Page, who's a pinup model from like the mid part of the 20th century, and obviously Disney wasn't really gonna have that, so they had to tone that part down and change that. And the story's a little bit different. There's references to like Doc Savage and other like pulp era characters from the era of kind of when the movie was going to be taking place that Dave Stevens had read as a kid, and wanted to kind of call back to. So it's slightly different. So I think the movie kind of took that and made it a little bit more accessible, because the comics were really hard. They were really hard to find. I had a regular ritual as a kid. There weren't that many comic book stores kind of around, and I didn't really read comic books. But if I happened to find a comic book store, I often would go in, and I often kind of wished I was a fan of like Batman or like Superman or something like that, because it would be really easy to find stuff. But I was a fan of the Rocketeer, so I'd go in and to the R section. I always did the same thing. I would go in and I'd go to the R section, and if anything, like there usually were no comic books, and because they were published by so many different like publishers over the course of like, I don't know, a decade or more, I think, it was often hard to find the comics. And sometimes I would ask, like, do you have the Rocketeer? And usually the person behind the front desk would be like, oh yeah, that's such a great book. But often they wouldn't have it, or they would have like something like there was a like one of those movie comic adaptations. Like when the movie would come out, they would do like a a comic book for it, and it usually was
Yeah.
like it usually wasn't that great of a comic book, but it was it was something that you could take home, kind of like those movie novelizations that would come out around the same time.
Yeah. Did it have a novelization?
It did,
It
yeah,
did, okay.
it did, yeah. And
So no, I definitely read the comic because I actually read
Yeah.
that before even seeing the movie. And
Yeah.
I don't remember too much of a difference between them, but it kind of doesn't really have that same effect as watching this world come to life versus
Right.
that's just standard comic book art. Because the funny thing is, it really does capture that sort of comic book feel for a movie, and that's kind of like a good part of the spectacle of it. But when you're reading it in a comic book form, it's kind of like, well, yeah, that's normal, right?
Yeah, and it's kind of I don't know, it's kind of toned down, or it's kind of like almost obviously the comic's two-dimensional, but it's even more so. I don't quite know how to describe it. There's actually, if you can find it, you can find it on eBay. Actually, there's a three-dimensional comic, which is actually done by another illustrator. But it comes with a little tape, which is like a radio show performance of the Rocketeer, but not the movie. It's like the comic version of the movie. And if you can find that on eBay, it's actually kind of cool because it's between the two. Like it's almost like it's more comic booky than the actual comic adaptation, and
Right.
not as. But not as kind of three-dimensional as the movie. So it's kind of like a nice in between, and it's a good one for kids. Like I tried showing it to my kids, and they immediately like manhandled it, ripped it, or whatever.
Oh,
but I mean
yeah.
that's it's the kind of like the point of it.
Of course, right.
I'd rather them enjoy it, and because they've gotten into the Rocketeer as well, which is kind of one of the sort of a coincidence that we're doing this episode when we are. Because I think we've started talking about this, like, I don't know, sometime in the summer or something like that. Right?
Something like that. It took a long
like
while
that.
because I actually had no real means of watching it until Disney Plus came around quite recently. So
Yeah, but there's an animated show that came out for kids in November.
Oh,
So they've updated the story a little bit. There's a young girl who basically just inherits a rocket pack, and they have a few scenes from the where they show the original Rocketeer in there. So she's like the great granddaughter of Cliff Secord, I think it is. So it's a nice little way to kind of introduce kids to the Rocketeer.
mhm.
And so it's been my daughter's new like favorite show, and my son, who's 2, is into it as well. So when I was home here, like visiting my folks, I found like a Rocketeer helmet that I actually made when I was a kid, like out of like an army, one of those plastic army, helmets. Like I
yeah.
stuck like a cardboard face on it, and cut out the eye holes and the mouth holes, and hot glued the fin to the top and painted it yellow. I found that and pulled that out, and they were playing with it today. So. So it's kind of like the animated show is kind of a nice way of introducing the character to kids, and like you said, like the movie itself is fairly family friendly, but I think older kids will get more out of it,
Mm-hmm.
and so my kids have seen like a few snippets of it, like when the Rocketeer is taking off, and a few things like that are pretty easy to understand. But I think I'll wait a couple years before they actually watch the whole thing. I mean, I think you're right. Like it was one of those films that didn't have like a built-in audience necessarily. I think it would have done fine, today, because kind of comic book movies are more like in vogue.
It would have looked
I'm not
very
really
different if it came out today.
Yeah.
Not even just
Yeah.
visually, but it would have been I think one of the charms of the Rocketeer is that it's so contained into its own story. It doesn't need to go too much over the top with the action, because it really is just a toned down story about this one guy who finds a rocket. And spoilers from here on out, but basically, like, kind of funny thing is that this pretty much covers entirely from when he finds the rocket to when he loses the rocket. So it's like,
right.
he doesn't even get a chance to really be a superhero.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very short period of time. Like,
but nowadays, if it came out, then they'd have to show him like fighting crime and beating up bad guys left and right and stuff like that. But this is totally just like, I think there's like, if I recall, there's like a scene where he like tries to punch out a cop, and the cop just like punches him and knocks him out. Like, he's just like totally not.
Yeah, he's maybe in the beginning that you're referring to, but he's like, I think one of the things I guess I liked about it, he's just like an average guy. He's an ordinary guy who, like, even, I don't know, I don't really know that much about superheroes, but even if you look at like Batman, like his superpower, he's got a lot of money, right? Yeah, and he's got all these gadgets and resources, and this is a guy who, like, just to quote a line from the movie, he's got like, holes in his pockets, and he's trying to make ends meet. He's out of work or in danger of losing his job. I think he sort of loses it in one of his gigs in the process of the film. And he and his girlfriend, I mean, part of the charm of it, I guess they're constantly sort of squabbling. They toned that down a little bit in the movie, but it's sort of a very like everyman kind of character. And
well, they really nailed the lovable loser kind of character with Cliff Secord, because he just is. You really root for him, but he just really is kind of like screwing everything up for himself.
Yeah, I mean, even if you think about like there's a couple scenes, like many of the scenes where he has the rocket pack and he's supposed to be doing something heroic, he sort of bumbles his way through it. It still works out for him, okay. But he, it's not a polished sort of thing. Like, just one example, like, he's often, it's interesting. Like they often will show the Rocketeer with a handgun, in his hand, obviously in his hand, but, that's often like, drawn in covers, and, people draw art and stuff like that. He managed to snatch one up, from one of the So another spoiler alert: there are Nazi paratroopers in the film in the end. So if you haven't seen it again, 1938, pre-World War II, at least for the U.S. But he manages to get a firearm, but he loses it in the span of maybe a couple of minutes.
Right.
And for all the I guess the hype and posters that show him holding a gun, because I guess a superhero has to hold a gun or whatever, or some kind of weapon. He gets knocked out of his hand like almost immediately. And I think even his when he takes off, most of the time when he flies the actual rocket pack, it's he's basically one step away from killing himself. The entire time, crashing into things and that sort of thing. So I mean, it's fairly relatable, I guess, his sort of haplessness and also kind of maybe naivete and sort of. But on top of that, he is a very lucky character, and he's there's got a lot of pluck, so he's a very kind of likable, I think, character. Yeah. I found him a little less likable in the comic. But the original comic, because he's sort of more grumpy, I think. Right. Even there, like, I think he's a very likable character overall.
Well, one thing that I kind of started to wonder watching it the second time more recently was because, like you said, it takes him a while to really kind of figure out how to use the rocket pack, and the first time they even turn it on, they show it like flying off the distance, flying back, and just destroys the statue that they tied it to. And then they give him the helmet, which is to help him steer, as it turns out. But he didn't realize that at first, so he kind of spins out of control. And it's just a very hazardous thing to try to even learn to figure out. I kind of wondered, like, at the end, huge spoiler. This is like the big climactic end of the movie. Timothy Dalton, the villain, I forget his name, he manages to get the rocket pack away, and then Cliff takes off the piece of gum that was covering a little bullet hole over the fuel line. So when Timothy Dalton tries to fly away, the flames ignite the fuel and it blows up the rocket pack. I was sort of thinking, like, would he have survived even if he hadn't done that? Like, it seems like he could have just let him go and let him kill himself anyways, because I don't think the guy clearly doesn't know or have any experience on how to use it. They're like hundreds of feet in the air. And,
yeah, and he doesn't have the helmet. Right? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, so literally, like, talk about a hero being held together by, like, chewing gum and twine. I mean, literally, the rocket pack, it picks up a ricochet at some point from a bullet, and there's a hole in the fuselage, and so Cliff, his, I don't know, I guess his, like, Obi-Wan or whatever is played by Alan Arkin, who's like his mechanic, like as a pilot, and he jams some gum into the hole to keep it all together.
Yeah, his lucky gum.
His lucky gum, Beeman's gum. So if you can actually still get Beeman's gum.
Is it really?
Yeah, I mean it's I don't think it's the original, like I don't know if it's the original, like, recipe or original, like, maker or whatever, but you can still get it. It's made by Adams at this point. Sometimes novelty shops and stuff like that will have it. You can certainly get it online, but has this I don't know if it's entirely true, but at least reputation for being a lucky gum for aviators. And so comes up in some movies, I think, like The Right Stuff and stuff like that. You'll see, like, references to Beeman's gum. And the idea was, like, the original, like, wrapper for Beeman's used to say, like, I think pepsin gum. So the idea was, like, it had this, pepsin, it's an enzyme that helps you digest your food. And so, I don't know, aviators would chew it maybe to calm their indigestion, from flying. I guess that's the way it was marketed, I guess, at the time, or the reputation that it had. And so there's a lot of little references, and one of the things I love about the movie, there's so many little references to things of the period. So I've, as a kid, my favorite airplane was the GB Racer, which is the sort of short, stubby little plane that Cliff flies in the beginning.
Not the Spruce Goose.
So yeah, right. No, not the one he glides, but the actual, the racer one that he flies and then crashes, actually, shortly afterwards. But it was this racing plane in the 30s. And there's so if you kind of like that sort of golden age of aviation, there's so many great planes to see in there too. Like, and I think, like you had mentioned, the movie would be different if it had been done today. They probably wouldn't have used real planes.
Yeah,
I don't know how many of those planes are still, like, this was filmed, like, what, 20, well, almost 30 years ago. So how many of those planes are still, like, functional at this point? I mean, that was 30 years ago, so maybe some would be, but it probably would have been like CGI or something like that today. So I would imagine that would probably feel different and look different than something that was, all those planes were actually flown in the air making the movie. And that's just a, kind of a very different kind of thing. But anyway, there's all these little snippets of, like, slices of life of, what it might have been like for Cliff and Jenny and these other characters living their life, pre-World War II. So it's kind of a neat little snippet of that.
And you got around to trying the video game adaptations, right?
Yeah. So the movie, like, it's like probably my favorite movie of all time. The video games are, man, those things are so bogus. I mean, I always wanted to like them.
Yeah. Really, what systems did they come out for again?
So they came out for the NES.
Okay.
And the Rocketeer has one of the great things about the Rocketeer is the soundtrack. So it has a great soundtrack. I have it on my phone, listen to it all the time. It's unfortunately really hard to find the actual soundtrack now. But none of the games have it, and without, it's like one of these things where the music is such a part of the experience that without it, you really kind of like, you just notice that there's this absence. It's not that it's necessarily bad. It's just that there's a hole that's not there. And a lot of other Nintendo games have struggled with that. Like, it's not like it couldn't have been done, like with MIDI or whatever. It's a very simple melody to even include, but the NES version of the Rocketeer has an incredibly annoying like chiptune. I struggle to even call it soundtrack, but it just sounds like a bunch of noises repeating over and over again.
Right.
And you start out as Cliff running around. You already have like the helmet and the outfit and everything like that, but you don't have the rocket pack, and you have no weapons, and you're being like, assaulted by various goons and stuff like that. And the only thing you can do is punch them, but but they're shooting at you. So the only way you have to duck the punches and get sort of inch close enough to like punch them in the groin, basically. And all the while, like when you move forward, of course you have to stand up. So you get shot, you duck down, punch the guy in the dong. And then if it doesn't go down, you have to do it again. And so your life meter goes down and down. It's a very frustrating game to play. And when you finally get the jetpack, you of course need fuel for it. So that was another thing in the movie. They totally dismissed the fact that there would be a limited fuel supply for this thing. They kind of pass it off as like, well, it runs on alcohol and stuff like that. But it's total like flight of fancy, basically, pun intended. And in the video game, they try to be more realistic about it, but the gameplay totally suffers because you can only basically do like little like I don't know what you want to call them, like little hops basically, and then you're running out of fuel, and you're also running out of ammunition constantly. So again, a nod to realism, but it just doesn't always make for great gameplay. So if they could have made it so you have unlimited like ammunition, unlimited fuel for the jetpack, because he seemed to have unlimited fuel in the movie. Yeah. It probably would have been a more enjoyable experience.
Right.
So that was the NES version. And then they had a PC version, which you can actually play online. It's like one of these like play a DOS game in a browser kind of thing, which it does work, though it works better if you can like emulate it through DOSBox or whatever. So the PC version is a weird one because the actual one that came out for the PC made an attempt to be kind of like the comic book that Dave Stevens drew, but kind of also like the movie. And there was a port that came out for the Super Nintendo, which was a little bit different. So the rocket pack was more along the lines of the one that was in the comic book, not the one that was in the film, and they lengthened parts of it. But the one for the PC, as far as I can tell, is fairly like self-contained. It's like 4 or 5 levels, and they're like almost like little mini games. I don't know. I find it quite frustrating, but the graphics are quite good, I think, for the time. But it's just the controls are like really awkward. So there's a couple different levels. There's like almost like a not rail shooter, but kind of like a target practice one where you're shooting random rocket men, and there's like a side-scrolling one where he's flying through the air and you're shooting things, and then there's a flying one where you have to fly a racer around pylons, and a few others like that. So it feels like kind of like a bunch of like mini games all kind of put together. The funny thing is, like when as I mentioned, like the Rocketeer is often holding a gun in like the advertising kind of stuff. Right. For whatever reason, I don't know if it's because of a Disney movie or game or whatever, he's actually holding, like, believe it or not, a super soaker, like the water gun.
Are you serious?
Yeah. If you look at
I never saw this.
Yeah. It's if I can capture an image of it, I'll send it to you. It's so weird because on the front cover of it, he's holding like this thing that looks like a pistol, and then it has like this like circular tank on top of it, and then they have some comic panels afterwards as the game progresses, and they show like these enemy rocket men holding what basically looks like a Super Soaker 30. Totally, it's like, and that's when those things were popular. Did they? I don't know if what they thought, like they looked like Space Age or something like that. Or that's and they I think they even say it's like a German blaster or whatever. I don't know. It's just sort of a funny thing, but the actual PC version, I think they tried hard to make it a good experience. There's like, voice acting and everything like that. And it's not bad, So I think they tried. It's just it's kind of like a difficult game to play. And I think if you play it with the expectations that you would have for a game now, obviously it's going to fall short. But I think if you kind of, I think you guys had talked about this in one of your episodes. Like if you kind of kind of pretend what expectations you would have like in 1991 or whatever, playing one of these things, I think it goes a little bit better.
Right.
It's still hard as hell, I think, to control. I think frustrating. A lot of games were then.
Yeah.
So I don't know, the Rocketeer games, like I spent a long time like wanting to like them and being very frustrated with them and wishing they had the music and they had better controls and things like that. There are some others, I don't know if you've played any of these, that are a little bit better and a little bit more accessible. There's one that came out, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or more, called Dark Void. It's a 3D, flying sort of
I've heard that name, but I don't know anything about it, so I had no idea.
Yeah, it's sort of set in the same period. Again, you're playing a pilot. It looks very similar to Cliff Secord in terms of the outfit and kind of mannerisms and everything like that. And you get a rocket pack. So if you Google Dark Void, you can see a guy rocketing through the air, basically looking like the Rocketeer. Even as a helmet that looks vaguely like it. I don't think it has the fin, but anyway. And you actually get to play a flying kind of shooting game. Like I think they probably would have wanted to make for the Rocketeer had they had the ability to do so in the early 90s.
Mm-hmm. So
it's not bad. And then the best one, I think, well, actually there's another one I've never played it, but I think I've tried to play it and it didn't work, called Rocket Ranger, which I think came out in the mid 80s or mid to late 80s. Which, again, the cover of it, if you Google it, Rocket Ranger, will show a guy holding a girl, like taking off into the air with a rocket pack. So I think it was influenced by at least the comic book. The movie wasn't out yet.
Yeah, I think I actually have that one because I think somebody suggested I try playing that and talk about it on the show one of these days. Of course, being a game that I haven't played before, I haven't really found the time to do so yet. But it is available on GOG. I do know that because that's how I have a copy of it.
Okay, yeah.
But it's actually I don't know if there was a PC version. I know there was the version on GOG at any rate is emulated from the Amiga.
Oh, okay. I always assumed there was a PC version because I remember it in the stores. I remember seeing it and seeing the cover or the box, like when these things had boxes, and looking at it and in the back and looking, oh, this looks great. I'd like to play this. But I probably didn't have whatever it cost to play it, $50 or $70, some crazy astronomical amount for like a single disc and a whatever it was then. But
I actually just looked it up right now, and it turns out that if you buy it on GOG, it does come with an Amiga and a DOS version. The Amiga being the original, and if you're German, there's also a German Amiga edition apparently.
Okay.
So, but yeah, it is. You do have both. You do have your choice. There is a port to the PC as well.
Yeah, and it's a very similar story from what I understand. Like, guy has rocket pack. Germans want it. Sort of World War II era kind of flying shooting game. So, I think I don't know if the actual like the PC adaptation of the Rocketeer was trying to be this game that actually came out earlier, because they're sort of similar in some ways. I think the Rocket Ranger one is probably at least the more played one,
right?
it doesn't have Germans holding super soakers. But my favorite actually is, I don't know if you've played it, but it's this game called Broforce.
I have not heard of that.
It's it's like a pixelated game, pixelated pixel art kind of 8-bit style kind of game that was takes all these 80s and early 90s action heroes and puts them all into one game. And to get around any like copyright issues, instead of like the actual name of the character, like Conan or like Rocketeer or like MacGyver, it fits it into bro. So Conan became like Bronan, and Rocketeer became like Brocketeer. And so you get all these different, like, it's kind of like one of these games for like one of those fighting games where you start with one character. When that character like eats it, then you switch to another one, and until you get to the end of the level. And so you start with one character, and they're a cute little 8-bit kind of style, like characters that you might have played with Nintendo or something like that. And the goal is to get to the end of the level and destroy a bunch of stuff and like in the process. And so if you're a fan of like 80s action movies and stuff like that, there's like Terminators and Stallone, Rambo is
right.
Brambo or something like that, and it looks just like the character, but so it's like and there's a like a lot of like 80s kind of like references, get to the chopper and all that kind of stuff thrown in with like a synth wavy like heavy metal kind of soundtrack that goes with it. So it's like a lot of fun. It's a very casual kind of game. It's a game you can play with other people, but there is a Rocketeer in the game, and he has his rocket pack, and so it's like one of the few, I think, games where the Rocketeer has actually done some level of justice, even though it's not an official Rocketeer product. So yeah, the games they're an experience. I think if you haven't seen this particular movie and you're just kind of like wondering what it's all about, I would say give it a go, especially if you have Disney Plus or somebody that has it, or you can just look on eBay and you can find it there. I mean, it's a fun one to share with people. It's always kind of a neat thing to recommend to people, at least for in my experience, to recommend to other people, because it's a wide variety of ages can enjoy it, and it's also kind of like an optimistic story. There is, unfortunately, it's like one of those films like that maybe there'll be like a renaissance in the future, but it didn't really get it wasn't a lot of stuff that was associated with it.
Right.
So if you get like even the special edition, whatever, I don't have like a Blu-ray machine or whatever to play, but the like even like the special edition Blu-ray doesn't come with anything really aside from the actual movie.
Right.
So there are a few other things you can look at. There's a little documentary, like a 30-minute documentary you can look up on YouTube called like Rocketeer Excitement in the Air, which I think was like somewhat like behind the scenes thing. It was actually hosted by Bill Campbell, who's the lead in the Rocketeer.
Right.
And it's kind of like a fun little thing about real life, like Rocket Man, like what a real life jetpack would look like, as well as some stuff about early aviation and behind the scenes making of it.
Well, I remember back in the day, especially like the early 90s and stuff like that, especially with the age of like these huge marquee blockbusters of the 90s, they would put together like a good, as you kind of described, like a half-hour kind of behind the scenes, just as part of like the hype to lead up to the movie coming out. Yeah, and I think this probably came out around the same time, and it's kind of a shame that it's very hard. It's kind of hard to find. Like the only copy I've been able to find like is like the sort of is one that Some Kind Soul has uploaded to YouTube. But you can find it there. It's like one of those things that would have been an easy thing, I think, to stick on like the DVD or whatever, and it's not there. So hopefully Disney will like
produce like something with it, maybe for the 30th edition or something like that, that has special features other than like, French subtitles or something like that. And then there's also like, if you enjoy learning more about the movie, I just discovered it literally like, I don't know, maybe 2 months ago. There were a group of guys who created a whole podcast, and I had no idea about this. Like it's where people will take a movie and do it minute by minute. So each episode is basically a minute where they discuss it. So the Rocketeer is like 108, 109 minutes long. So right then and there, you have like that many episodes, and they go deep into it. So it's called the Rocketeer Minute. You can find it on iTunes. It's amazing. It's like almost getting a college level education in like the Rocketeer, and the time period and all the things that kind of went into it. So it's just a lot of stuff about the time period, how the movie was made. They get a number of the actors and writers, like Paul DeMeo, Danny Bilson, who were the writers for it. Joe Johnston, who was the director, he's in the last couple episodes, he directed like Captain America and October Sky and those other movies like that. Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Bill Campbell, who's the Rocketeer himself, is like a recurring guest. It's just a lot of fun. So you can find that anywhere. So like I wish I had known about that earlier.
Right.
But every now and then I would go up and like, I would just like randomly, like ever since the movie, like I saw the movie, I would, go on the internet and just type in like Rocketeer into Google and see what came up. And I think I found this randomly, the podcast randomly through one of those searches. So that's a great resource. And if you're interested in that kind of like, escapist kind of, fantasy / science fiction. I wrote this little book called 13th Hour, and the hero of it, his name is Logan, who flies on a hoverboard, the writing of his character was influenced a lot by like, the way Cliff was portrayed in the movie.
Right.
Sort of a, even as a sort of same kind of all over the place haircut, kind of a regular guy, kind of naive in some way, a bit hapless. He certainly doesn't have any special like superpowers or anything like that, but he's a sort of a good person at heart. And through a combination of, luck and pluck, does his best, but gets into some, calamities along the way. But I think the tone of the story, I think, was very much influenced by like the tone of the Rocketeer and a lot of other movies kind of along that era, like, like I mentioned, Never Ending Story, Last Starfighter, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So you can find more about that on my website, 13thr.wordpress.com, or just by looking under like the 13th Hour podcast.
Right.
On iTunes and Stitcher and Spotify and places like that.
Right. And just because we need to wrap up, are there any, do you want to take the time for any shout outs?
Aside from the ones that I've mentioned so far, I would say, if you have small children, there is a Rocketeer animated series that you can watch on Disney Junior. And that there is one, I had no idea what this was. I didn't understand what Disney Junior was and what all this was, a couple months ago, but I'd heard that there was a Rocketeer animated series. I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. There hasn't been any Rocketeer content created in the last, almost 30 years. So got to check it out. But you can watch one free episode on the web. I guess it's the sort of thing you have to like subscribe to, pay for. I still don't really understand it, to be honest with you.
Is it part of Disney Plus?
No, I don't think so. I don't have Disney Plus, but I don't think it's part of that, which is very confusing. But you can actually, just like you would buy other shows, you can buy each episode individually, or you can buy, like I bought the whole season like on Amazon. But if you have small children, this takes a take on the Rocketeer, and it's also a young girl who assumes the mantle of the rocket pack, and uses it to kind of help her community. So it's like a very like kid friendly, parent friendly kind of show in a way to introduce kids, young children, to like Dave Stevens, the Rocketeer movie, aviation, all that kind of stuff. Like, I think it's kind of a nice entry point into all those things. Mm-hmm. So you can check that out. It's like the Rocketeer animated series on Disney.
Awesome. All right. Well, yeah, thank you very much for coming onto the show, and thanks for the chat. It was quite a pleasure to remember the Rocketeer with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's been like 30 years since I heard about it, and suddenly, not only you, but another good friend of mine has just been talking about it. Has been talking about it and bringing it up quite a bit recently. So it was really quite interesting to go back, look through it, and to sort of see see if it's as good as I remembered. And definitely, I would say that it does hold up over time. It's kind of it really is just as watchable now as it was when it came out. As long as you have that mindset to watch an early 90s movie.
Yeah, and I have to say, even when I've rewatched, I don't know, I've watched it so many times, but when I there was a period of time when I didn't watch it because I was afraid that if I rewatched it as an adult, it would kind of like get tarnished or whatever. So I avoided watching it for a while. And after a while, I was like, well, the hell with it, I'm just going to watch it. I liked it so much. And I actually thought it was better. Yeah. It doesn't have like a lot of the characteristics that you might associate it with like a sort of like a late 80s, 90s era movie. It's kind of like, I don't know why. Maybe it's because of the time period or what I was going for, the tone of it. But it kind of stands alone in that regard. So go watch it.
And on that note, thank you so much again for joining us. And it was great to have you, and I hope to have you back soon.
Yeah, absolutely. It's my pleasure, Rick. Take care.